My name is Erin Cole, and until the night of my sister's wedding anniversary, I believed that silence was the price of belonging. I was 34 years old, standing under warm golden lights in a rented banquet hall filled with people who shared my last name, and I had never felt more alone in my life. The room smelled like expensive perfume and overcooked chicken, the kind of place meant to celebrate success, tradition, and family unity. Everyone smiled easily. Everyone laughed loudly. Everyone except me. The event was supposed to be simple: 10 years of marriage, a renewal of vows, a toast, some dancing, and memories polished enough to post online. I arrived early like I always did because my mother asked me to help with last-minute details, adjust the seating cards, make sure the slideshow played correctly, pick up the cake from the side entrance because you're good at handling things. I didn't argue. I never did. I told myself it didn't matter, that I was part of something bigger than myself. My sister, Natalie, looked radiant in her ivory dress, her hand permanently linked with her husband's. My parents hovered near her like proud curators beside their finest exhibit. My dad moved through the room shaking hands, accepting compliments, retelling the same stories about sacrifice and family values. Every laugh he earned felt practiced. Every smile felt earned by everyone but me. I stayed near the edges, refilling water glasses, answering questions from relatives who still asked what I was doing these days, as if I were between lives instead of quietly surviving one. I had learned to keep my answers vague. I worked. I was fine. Everything was fine. Then the music softened. A microphone squealed. My father cleared his throat. And just like that, the room turned toward him. I didn't know yet that this would be the moment my life split cleanly in two. My father tapped the microphone again, smiling as the feedback settled, and the room quieted with obedient speed. He raised his glass toward my sister and her husband, praising their commitment, their growth, the beautiful family they were building. People nodded along, already anticipating the easy applause. I stood near the back, half hidden by a column, watching his performance with the detached focus of someone who had seen this play too many times. Then his tone shifted, subtle but unmistakable. He chuckled the way he always did before delivering what he called a joke. "Of course," he said, scanning the room, "not all our kids turned out quite as impressive." Laughter rippled politely. My stomach tightened. I knew that cadence. I had grown up inside it. His eyes found me. They always did. "Some people," he continued, "just don't have the drive. They float around, helping out here and there, never really building anything of their own." A few guests glanced over their shoulders, curiosity flickering into discomfort. My mother smiled thinly, eyes fixed on her glass. Natalie didn't look at me at all. I felt the heat rise in my face as he went on, describing responsibility, ambition, and how proud he was that Natalie had chosen stability over excuses. Each word landed with careful aim. Each pause invited laughter. And the room gave it to him, not loudly, not cruelly, but enough. I stood there while my father reduced my life to a punchline at my sister's celebration. I stood there while relatives nodded like this was wisdom being shared, not a son being dismantled in public. I stood there because standing was what I had always done. For a moment, I considered leaving quietly, slipping out before dessert, letting the humiliation dissolve into another story I'd tell myself didn't matter. That instinct was old and familiar, but something in me resisted it, a pressure behind my ribs that refused to settle. If you want the full truth, hit like, so this story reaches more people. My father finished his toast to applause. He raised his glass again, satisfied, as if he'd offered balance to the evening. The band began to play. Conversation resumed. People turned back to their plates, their phones, their lives. No one asked if I was okay. I realized then that this wasn't a misunderstanding. It was a demonstration, and I was the example. I moved before I could think myself out of it, past tables crowded with half-finished wine glasses, past relatives who had watched me grow up but never really seen me. I stepped outside into the cool night air, the muffled music following me through the doors before cutting off completely. The silence felt heavier than the noise inside. I stood under a string of white lights hung between two bare trees, breathing slowly, telling myself not to overreact. That was always my role, the reasonable one, the one who didn't make scenes. I had been trained to doubt my own reactions before I ever doubted someone else's behavior. If it hurt, I told myself it was because I was sensitive. If it felt unfair, I assumed I hadn't earned better. A memory surfaced uninvited. Me at 16, being told to give up my room because Natalie needed more space. Me at 22, being asked to postpone my plans because family needs you right now. Me at 30, sitting quietly while my father praised my sister's promotions and milestones, then turned to me and asked why I was still figuring things out. Always said with a smile, always framed as concern. The doors behind me opened. Natalie stepped out, heels clicking sharply against the pavement. "Aaron," she said, already annoyed. "Why did you walk out? Dad was just joking." Just joking. The phrase landed like it always did, neat and dismissive. "It didn't feel like a joke," I said, keeping my voice steady. She sighed, glancing back toward the hall. "You know how he is. Tonight isn't about you. Can you not make this weird?" I looked at her, really looked at her, and realized something painful and clarifying. She wasn't trying to hurt me. She just didn't consider me important enough to protect. "I didn't make it weird," I said. "He did." She shook her head. "You always do this. You take things personally. Dad's proud of you in his own way." In his own way. A way that required me to shrink so others could shine. She went back inside without waiting for my response. The doors closed again. The music swelled. The celebration continued. And I stood there, finally understanding that staying silent hadn't kept the peace. It had only kept me invisible. I went back inside because leaving forever doesn't happen all at once. Sometimes it starts with staying a little longer than you should, long enough to see the truth clearly. The cake had been cut. Champagne refilled. People were laughing again, relieved that the tension had passed without explanation. I took my seat at a side table and watched my family from a distance that suddenly felt permanent. My father moved easily through the crowd, clapping shoulders, telling stories that painted him as the architect of everyone's success. When he passed my table, he paused just long enough to lean in and say, "Try not to sulk. You don't want people thinking you're bitter." Then he walked away before I could respond. That was his final contribution to the night, the quiet reminder of my place. I didn't cry. That surprised me. What I felt instead was clarity. A calm, almost surgical awareness that this pattern wasn't temporary and it wasn't accidental. It had been reinforced for decades, polished by excuses, protected by tradition. And I had helped maintain it by staying. As dessert plates were cleared, my phone buzzed, a message from my mother. "You embarrassed your father tonight. We'll talk later." Not "are you okay?" Not that went too far, just discipline delivered on schedule. I thought about all the times I had defended them to friends, all the times I said, "They mean well," or "That's just how they show love." I had translated cruelty into concern so many times that I almost believed it myself. Across the room, I caught my reflection in a mirrored pillar. I looked smaller than I remembered, tired, like someone waiting for permission that was never coming. Comment justice if you believe she deserved justice. The word justice lingered in my mind, not as revenge, but as balance. As truth finally being allowed to exist without apology. I realized something then that shifted everything. I didn't need them to understand me. I needed to stop explaining myself to people committed to misunderstanding me. When the final song played and guests began to leave, I didn't rush to help clean up. I didn't volunteer to pack decorations or load gifts into cars. I watched my family scramble, confused by my absence from my usual role. No one asked where I was. That night, I drove home alone, windows down, the echo of my father's laughter fading behind me. And for the first time, the silence didn't feel empty. The drive home felt longer than usual, every red light giving my thoughts another chance to circle the same question. How many times does someone have to show you who they are before you believe them? I parked in front of my apartment building, the same cracked pavement, the same flickering porch light, and sat in the car long after the engine cooled. This place had never been impressive, but it had always been mine. And that night, it felt like the only place I could breathe. I didn't sleep much. My mind kept replaying moments I'd ignored for years, now stitched together into a pattern I could no longer deny. My father's jokes, my mother's silence, my sister's indifference wrapped in convenience. None of it had been accidental. It had simply been normalized. In the early hours of the morning, I opened my laptop and scrolled through old emails, half-finished plans, ideas I'd abandoned because someone else needed something from me. There was a folder I hadn't opened in months, labeled Later. Inside were documents, notes, and an unfinished application I'd started after a friend suggested I apply for a position out of state. I'd never submitted it. At the time, my mother had said the timing wasn't right. Natalie needed help with the kids. Dad was under stress. There would be time later. Later had finally arrived. I reread the job description carefully. It wasn't glamorous. It was stable, independent, far enough away that Sunday dinners would no longer be assumed. I updated my resume, hands steady, heart pounding, and attached it without overthinking. When I hit send, there was no dramatic music, no instant relief, just a quiet click and a strange sense of alignment. Type yes if you want to see all targets hit at once. That morning, my phone buzzed again. This time, a group message from my family. Plans for brunch, jokes about leftover cake, no mention of the toast, no acknowledgement of what had happened. I stared at the screen, then set the phone face down. For the first time, I didn't feel the urge to respond. Something had shifted, not outwardly. Nothing in my life had changed yet, but internally a line had been drawn. I understood now that leaving didn't require an announcement. It required consistency. It required choosing myself quietly again and again, even when no one was watching. And for the first time, that choice didn't feel selfish. It felt necessary. The days that followed were ordinary on the surface, which somehow made everything feel heavier. I went to work. I answered emails. I nodded politely in meetings. But underneath the routine, something fundamental had changed. I stopped volunteering information about my life. I stopped rearranging my schedule in anticipation of requests that hadn't even been made yet. It was like stepping out of a current I hadn't realized was pulling me under. My family noticed, of course. They always did when my usefulness dipped. My mother called first, her voice clipped and efficient. She wanted to clear the air, which I knew meant explaining why my reaction had been inappropriate. I let it go to voicemail. Then my father texted, a single line. "You need to stop being dramatic." I stared at the words for a long time before deleting them. A week later, Natalie showed up at my apartment without warning. She stood in the doorway, arms crossed, scanning the room like she was confirming her assumptions. "So this is what you're upset about," she said. "Dad made one comment and you're acting like the world ended." I didn't argue. I listened. That was new. She talked about stress, about how much pressure our parents were under, about how hard it was being the one everyone depended on. I almost laughed at that, but I held it back. Instead, I said something simple. "I'm not asking you to understand. I'm asking you to respect my boundaries." She frowned. "You've never had boundaries." "I know," I said. "That's the problem." She left soon after, frustrated and unconvinced. But I felt oddly calm. I had said what I needed to say without defending myself, without asking for permission. 2 weeks later, an email landed in my inbox. Subject line, offer. I read it 3 times before it felt real. The position was mine if I wanted it. Different city, different rhythm. A chance to build a life where my worth wasn't measured by how much I absorbed for others. I didn't tell my family right away. I waited. I packed slowly. I sorted through my apartment with intention, keeping only what felt like mine. Each decision was small, but together they formed something solid. By the time my mother called again, asking about holiday plans, my answer was already clear. "I won't be there," I said. The silence on the line was long and sharp, but it didn't scare me anymore. The announcement didn't land the way I expected. I had imagined raised voices, accusations, maybe even tears. Instead, my mother responded with a brittle laugh. "You're overreacting," she said. "Running away won't fix anything." My father took the phone and told me I was making a mistake I'd regret. That family was all I had in the end. Natalie texted later, asking how long this phase would last. None of them asked where I was going. None of them asked why I needed to leave. They were more concerned with how my absence would inconvenience them than with what my presence had cost me. Moving day came quietly. I loaded my car before sunrise, the sky still gray and undecided. There was no farewell dinner, no acknowledgement that anything was changing. I left my keys on the counter of my apartment and drove until the familiar streets gave way to something new. The farther I got, the lighter my chest felt, like I'd been holding my breath for years without realizing it. The new city didn't greet me with fireworks. It didn't need to. It offered anonymity, and that felt like freedom. I learned new routes, found a coffee shop where no one knew my last name, started a job where my contributions were noticed without being mined for extra labor. It was quiet. It was stable. It was mine. My family continued as if I were temporarily unavailable. Group chats carried on without me. Photos were posted. Inside jokes I no longer understood floated past on social media. Occasionally, my mother would send a message framed as concern but edged with disappointment. "Your father asks about you." I stopped translating what that meant. One evening, months later, a relative called to tell me my father had been telling people I'd abandoned the family. That hurt more than I expected. Not because it was untrue, but because it was easier for him to believe that than to acknowledge his role in why I left. Share this video so communities understand what was hiding. I realized then that my story wasn't just mine. It belonged to everyone who had been taught that loyalty meant self-erasure. Everyone who had stayed too long hoping kindness would be reciprocated instead of exploited. Leaving hadn't solved everything, but it had given me something I'd never had before: space. And in that space, I was finally learning who I was without their voices in my head. Time has a way of revealing things that distance alone cannot. Without me there to absorb tension, my family dynamics didn't improve. They intensified. Natalie called once late at night, her voice tight with frustration. "I didn't realize how much you handled," she admitted, then quickly added, "but that doesn't mean you had to disappear." I listened without interrupting, hearing the unspoken truth beneath her words. She missed the support, not the brother. My father sent an email a few weeks later. It was short and formal, as if we were negotiating a contract instead of a relationship. He wrote about disappointment, about sacrifice, about how families survive by enduring uncomfortable moments. He never mentioned the toast, never mentioned the laughter at my expense. The omission spoke louder than any apology could have. I began to notice how calm my days had become, not perfect, not painless, just quieter. I cooked dinner without rushing. I slept through the night. I laughed at work without checking myself. These were small freedoms, but they accumulated into something powerful. One afternoon, I ran into an old friend who knew my family well. She asked how everyone was doing, then paused. "You seem different," she said. "Lighter." I told her I'd moved. I didn't explain why. I didn't need to. The truth didn't require witnesses anymore. Occasionally, guilt crept in. Years of conditioning don't disappear overnight. When it did, I reminded myself of the banquet hall, the microphone, the laughter. I reminded myself that love does not demand humiliation as proof of loyalty. If this shocked you, comment, I am ANDRI below. I started therapy not long after, not because I was broken, but because I wanted to understand how I'd learned to accept so little. Naming patterns gave me language. Language gave me distance. Distance gave me peace. My family still tells their version of the story. In theirs, I'm ungrateful, sensitive, dramatic. In mine, I finally chose honesty over comfort. Both can exist. I no longer need to correct them. What surprised me most was this: leaving didn't make me harder. It made me gentler, with myself, with others. When you stop living in defense mode, compassion becomes possible again. And that, more than anything, confirmed I'd made the right choice. I used to think that leaving meant erasing everything that came before, like cutting a film strip and throwing the first half away. What I learned instead was that leaving simply changed the angle of the story. The past didn't disappear. It just stopped controlling the ending. I could remember my childhood now without immediately defending it, without rushing to explain why certain things weren't that bad. They had been bad. And acknowledging that didn't make me weak. It made me honest. There were moments when I missed them. Not the reality of who they were, but the version I'd hoped they could be. The father who protected instead of performed. The sister who noticed instead of benefited. The mother who intervened instead of enabled. Grief, I learned, isn't only about losing what you had. Sometimes it's about accepting what you never will. I built routines that belonged only to me. Saturday mornings at the same cafe. Evening walks without my phone. Friendships that weren't inherited but chosen. People who asked questions and waited for the answers. People who didn't treat my availability as a resource to be mined. Once at a work gathering, someone asked about my family. I answered simply, "We're not very close." No justification, no backstory. The sentence felt complete on its own. That was new. Months later, my father called unexpectedly. His voice was quieter than I remembered. He asked how work was. He told me about his garden. We spoke like acquaintances who shared a long history but no longer tried to rewrite it. Before hanging up, he said, "You didn't have to leave the way you did." I didn't argue. I just replied, "I did." That was the closest we came to the truth. I realized then that closure isn't something other people give you. It's something you decide to stop chasing. The moment I stopped waiting for them to understand was the moment I finally did. My life didn't become extraordinary. It became steady. And after years of emotional instability, that felt like luxury. I don't know if I'll ever go back to that banquet hall in my mind without feeling a twinge. But I do know this. That night didn't end me. It introduced me to myself. Sometimes people ask me if I regret it. If leaving was worth the fallout, the silence, the way my name still feels awkward in certain conversations. They usually ask with good intentions, but the question carries an assumption I no longer share. That staying would have been neutral. That endurance is always nobler than departure. I used to believe that too. It took walking away to understand how deeply wrong it was. Regret is about wishing you'd chosen differently when you didn't have the information you have now. I had the information. I had years of it. I had patterns repeated so consistently they could have been written down and studied. Leaving wasn't impulsive. It was overdue. I learned something else along the way. Families don't collapse because one person sets boundaries. They collapse when they were being held together by someone's silence. When I stopped absorbing the discomfort, it didn't disappear. It just became visible. And visibility is uncomfortable for people who benefit from things staying hidden. There are still days when I catch myself almost apologizing for taking up space. Old habits don't vanish quietly, but now I notice them. I pause, I correct course. Growth, I've learned, isn't dramatic. It's repetitive. It's choosing differently in small moments until those moments add up to a different life. My sister and I exchange occasional messages. Polite, careful. There's no hostility, but there's no closeness either. That's okay. Relationships don't have to be salvaged to be healed. Sometimes distance is the healthiest form of respect. I no longer attend events where I'm expected to shrink. I no longer laugh at jokes that rely on my self-erasure. I no longer confuse obligation with love. If this story resonates, it's probably because you've felt that pull too. The pressure to endure. The fear that leaving makes you the villain. The hope that if you just try harder, someone will finally see you. Here's the quiet truth I wish I'd learned sooner. You don't need to be humiliated to prove loyalty. You don't need to disappear to keep the peace. And you don't need permission to choose a life where you are treated with basic dignity. I'm telling this story now not because it makes me look strong, but because for a long time I was. I stayed quiet. I stayed useful. I stayed small because I believed that was the cost of belonging. And if you're listening to this, there's a chance you recognize that feeling. The slow erosion. The way you learn to measure your worth by how little trouble you cause. Leaving didn't turn me into a different person. It just removed the noise that kept drowning out my own voice. I still care. I still feel deeply. I just no longer offer those things to people who treat them as entitlement instead of gifts. My father may never understand what he took from me that night. My sister may always believe it was an overreaction. That's their story to live with. This one is mine. And for the first time, it doesn't end with me apologizing for existing. If there's one thing I hope you take from this, It's this. You are allowed to leave situations that humiliate you, even if everyone else calls it love. You are allowed to step away from roles that cost you your identity. And you are allowed to build a life that doesn't require you to disappear to keep it running. If you stayed until the end, thank you. That tells me this story touched something real in you. So here's my final ask. If this helped you feel seen in any way, hit like so this message reaches others who need it. In the comments, tell me honestly, if you were in my place, would you have stayed, or would you have walked away too? And if you want more stories that speak the truth people avoid saying out loud, subscribe, because sometimes hearing you're not alone is the first step toward choosing yourself.